Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2You Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit the website, which is at tutor2you.net/sociology. And there you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so my guest for this episode is Dr Bethany Robertson. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I always get people to start by introducing themselves. Tell us who you are, what you do.
So I mainly work within the area of rural sociology. So at the moment I'm working on various research projects which are looking at farming identities and cultures, and that's following on from my PhD, which I completed last year, which focused on women in agriculture in the UK, exploring some of the ways in which they present their gender identities and what their experiences of farming is like.
This is quite a niche area, Bethany. So I'm wondering your own background. Do you grow up on a farm yourself? Is that right?
Yes, I did indeed. So I grew up on a farm, and I guess while I was growing up, I'd kind of become familiarised with some of the stereotypes in terms of gender. And when I went to university, I discovered that a lot of the sociology that we were studying didn't seem to resonate with my upbringing, in the sense that of course it was very important to study urban context and think about things like street culture and urban inequalities, but there seemed to be a big gap in terms of perhaps more rural forms of work and inequalities. So that's what led me to quite a niche area, really, and try and address this gap that I'd identified.
Yeah, you said it's quite a big gap. Is there anyone else producing any similar work to yourself? Are you the lone person looking at this sort of area?
So it tends to be quite localized, in the sense that the empirical studies around farming are usually based within certain farming communities. So I know there's a lot of work going on at the moment in Scotland, for example, around the crofters, and I guess that's based on the different types of farming that goes on in different areas. So for my PhD specifically, I was focusing on Yorkshire and Norfolk, for example,
Yes.
Because each area kind of presents different farming types, which influences how farmers experience their work and experience certain inequalities within that.
And you mentioned, we're going to look at this a little bit further about gender identities of women in farming. Do you have an idea in kind of percentages? What percentage of those working in that industry are male? I'm guessing it's massive in terms of a percentage.
Yes, well, one of the issues really is that with the statistics in terms of what we actually mean by a farmer.
Yeah.
So a lot of the statistics are based on the idea of a farm owner. And that was one of the things I picked up on in my project that was perhaps making some women invisible, because even though the women I spoke to were farmers in their own right, they might not necessarily have owned land themselves. So I think the stats, it's now 80-20 roughly, the split, but it's very hard to tell because, as I say, I think the statistics kind of skew it, because there seems to be such a narrow definition of what a farmer is. And part of my PhD was to let us consider actually what does it mean to be a farmer in a contemporary setting in the UK. And actually it's quite diverse now. It's not just that manual labour, it's actually more a lot more to do with paperwork, social media, networking, and the kind of more business orientated side of the work.
Yeah, I just wondered if, for example, a couple owned a farm, we still refer to farmer and farmer's wife. It sounds quite an antiquated way of putting it, but I wondered if that still existed.
Yes, that's the crux of the stereotype, really, in the sense that, you know, a wife and husband might be working in a farm partnership, but usually the woman in the team would be kind of marginalised as just the wife in a supporting role, when in actual fact, you know, her role is of equal importance to running that business. I think that's part of the issue that spurred on this project. That if that's the case, how do we move on from that?
Yeah, it interests me. My sister was a former shepherd, and she often got referred to as a shepherdess, which I thought was always interesting because the word shepherd would have done. I'm not sure why she was referred to as a shepherdess.
Yes, there's all these like gendered marked terms, and some of the women I spoke to would refer to themselves, you know, as a shepherdess rather than a shepherd. And I think it's really nuanced, because in a way it's trying to make them stand out and kind of communicate the idea that actually you can be a woman and working in farming, and they're doing this job in challenging those long established gender stereotypes. But it's very nuanced in the sense that, does that shepherdess still kind of is still secondary to the default terminology?
Yes.
So it's really tricky to navigate the language used, really, in terms of whether that might be empowering for certain women, but for others might not feel that it's doing that same justice to what their work they're doing.
Yeah, yeah. Should we start with your methodology, Bethany? How do you collect your information and research?
So for my PhD, I interviewed women farmers across the UK, and I was very keen to take an ethnographic approach to the interviews. So really immersing myself in the environments that were familiar to these farmers. So getting a sense of the farm in which they're working, their home, to really build an idea of what their working life is like. And I think that was important, even though I was from a farming background myself. I haven't actually worked in farming, so I didn't want to claim some kind of insider status that wasn't perhaps entirely relevant to these women. So I went out onto farms and was shown around the farms in a lot of cases, but mainly it was interviewing and getting the women to show me objects that were connected to their farming achievements and their farming life. So, for example, we would talk about rosettes from showing animals that they won at agricultural shows. We talked about photographs of perhaps the family history of the farm, or animals that they particularly bonded with, and that were quite memorable. And that all gave it this quite emotive and lively discussion, really, about their journey into that area of work, and often some of the quite difficult experiences they'd had getting into the field they're in. So yeah, it was very much in-depth interviews that gave me a sense of their kind of worldview from where they are at the moment.
Because you just mentioned difficulty getting into farming. Were the majority of the women you spoke to then, they went into it rather than being born into a farming family as such?
So I was keen to speak to a mixture of women, because there is such a there's increasingly diverse number of ways that women can get into farming now. So as you say, the kind of traditional assumption would be that women would marry into farming or they would be born into farming. But even in that case, there'd be difficulties in terms of perhaps bias towards sons rather than daughters inheriting the farm. Yeah. But a lot of the women I spoke to actually had made that, I guess, choice. So perhaps they'd been born into a more urban environment and they'd discovered a love for animals, for example, and that had led on to them studying farming at an agricultural college. So it allowed that entry, but there were still certain experiences that suggested it was unusual for women to go into that area. So, for example, experiences within an agricultural college where the way in which the teachers had interacted with the women and kind of funneled them into certain farming tasks rather than others. And also, once leaving education settings, actually getting access to land, for example, presents an issue for some women. So kind of this competition for land amongst other men farmers, for example, who might be more well known within the area. Yeah. And a lot of the women felt they had to prove themselves in ways that the men didn't.
Because I was going to ask you that. I think you just started to touch on it. Did women tend to go into a particular type of farming, or perhaps pushed into a particular type of farming?
It's hard to say, because a lot of the women I spoke to suggested that they had discovered a passion for the particular type that they had chosen to partake in, whether that was more crop-based or livestock-based. But I think there's a sense that if they grew up on a family farm, they would follow the tasks that their parents had kind of suggested they participated in. So, for example, if their mother had been more active working within the livestock area, then that might have encouraged them to follow that route as well. And again, there has been this assumption that women might be more suited to livestock farming and working with animals, based on this idea of a supposed kind of emotional connection that they might feel, especially towards expectant mothers. And there's some issues in terms of making that assumption, I think. But for a lot of the women I spoke to, that actually empowered them in a sense, because they felt like that enabled women to find a place in farming, and they felt like they brought unique skills that hadn't previously been capitalized on in farming, and that it was really about this teamwork mentality of bringing something new to a team that perhaps they felt men didn't have so much.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Bethany. That's going to be the end of part 1. In part 2, we'll talk more about your own research.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr Bethany Robertson. Bethany, we're just talking about your research into women and farming. I was just interested to know what kind of some of the common experiences were from the findings of talking to the women.
Yes, so as I was saying earlier, one part of the research was thinking through some of the ways in which women enter farming and how they might be shaped by certain assumptions around gender, but also their experiences once they have entered the industry. Because we hear a lot recently in the press about how there's more women entering farming, more women farmers, which is brilliant, but not so much their experiences and how they might be subject to certain sexist experiences within that setting. So, for example, a lot of the women I spoke to would be interacting with others within the agricultural industry coming in onto the farm. So, for example, agronomists, vet, and often those individuals would arrive at the farm and would ask them for the farmer. Where's the farmer? Can I speak to them? And that's based on this idea that they were women, and so they couldn't possibly be the head of this business or doing the manual labour. And that kind of perpetuated the idea that women are out of place in that setting, and that they can't be a farmer in their own right.
Yeah.
Based on some of these traditional stereotypes. And then that would follow through really into, in some cases, the setup of the farm. So the farm being arranged in a way that might be more suited to the supposed strength of a man, and women having to find new ways to navigate, for example, heavy objects, gates, and things like that. And that's not to say that there is necessarily a kind of bias in strength between men and women, and it isn't such a straightforward dichotomy as that. But for the women I spoke to, that's how they experienced it, in that the default way of working was geared up towards men, and that they had to make a special effort and kind of put more hours into the job in order to get the same work done that a man might do in a shorter space of time.
Yeah, I'd wondered as well if anyone had experienced sort of what you'd call outright sexism, just, clear and blatant.
Yeah, I think I think one of the nuanced aspects of the research really is the experiences that women would tell me they might not necessarily see as sexist, because these attitudes have long been established in the industry, and they've almost become not so normalised that they don't see it in such a way. Whereas as a researcher, the attitudes clearly are sexist in my eyes, and I think one of the issues with that is that the women I spoke to, they couldn't quite resonate with feminism or what they thought feminism to mean. Yeah. So I think often we sit, the kind of common view might be thinking about things like equal pay, for example, in a more corporate setting, whereas in the world of farming, something like that is more difficult to conceive, because often you're not hardly seeing a wage, and it's not governed in such a manner that those strategies to deal with discrimination or sexism can't be implemented. So I think feminism was also seen as problematic in the sense that women farmers want to work in a team with men, and that perhaps the assumption of feminism is that it works against men and puts women on a pedestal, which equally they weren't advocating within farm work. So I think going forward, it's quite interesting to think about how feminism might be applicable within the rural setting and might influence the ways that women talk about their experiences, and move towards how they might be kind of challenged in their everyday life, and not necessarily having to accept them as some of the women I spoke to did do.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Was there just kind of a casual acceptance that that's just the way things were? That was what the industry was like then?
I think that was a really interesting use of, I guess, humour or kind of turning assumptions on its head. So, for example, earlier we talked about this assumption of the farmer being a man and a woman in farming being a farmer's wife. Yeah. So a lot of the women I spoke to would call a man a farmer's husband. Yeah. So they say, "Oh, are you the farmer's husband then?" And I think that was a really clever way, by turning that on its head, it shows just how ridiculous it is in those such narrow gender roles, that in other spheres today just seem absolutely ridiculous and outdated. So that was one way in which the women challenged those sexist attitudes that they were experiencing, and also just kind of accentuating the fact that women can farm in terms of perhaps how they dressed. So having long hair and looking and feeling like a woman while also undertaking quite hard manual labour, and in doing so really showing how challenging that dichotomy of women not being able to farm that had traditionally been cemented within farming.
Yeah, I was having a chuckle at one of your publications. My tractor drives itself. I'll put the GPS on and paint my nails.
Yes. Oh, that quote is brilliant.
Yeah.
And I think it really highlights how technology in farming offers new opportunities for women. And again, I think the public perception of farming is this very antiquated idea of someone with straw hanging out their mouth, but in actual fact, in some cases farmers are using these tractors that can drive themselves, and actually it's more about kind of navigating that technology, using data from the crops, from the yields, and making sense of that data rather than the hard manual graft. And yeah, that lady just shows, you can still paint your nails and feel feminine if you want to while doing this kind of work, which is brilliant.
Yeah, the new face of farming, if you like.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Maybe let's talk about your kind of overall findings from your research then.
Yes, so the focus in particular was thinking about how women farmers embody being a woman and also a farmer when these two identities have traditionally been conceived as being at odds. So one of the findings that was interesting was the way in which they actually present their bodies. So a lot of these stereotypes come down to the assumption that men are stronger than women, for example, so that might mean that women can't farm as well. And so I found that a lot of the sexist interactions that they had experienced came down to the way in which they used their bodies or the way in which they presented their bodies in terms of dress, for example, or hair. And actually, in terms of hair and dress, for example, that offered an opportunity to present themselves in different ways depending on the different contexts in which they found themselves. So, for example, they might have to wear overalls that might be deemed masculine when they're farming, but actually outside of their work they could accentuate their femininity, for example. And there was a lot of interesting nuances to this in terms of also being misidentified by other farmers. So if they were working on a farm wearing overalls and had short hair, they would be misidentified a lot of the time as a man, and how that was quite tricky to navigate in terms of, again, being deemed out of place within that farming setting. But the fact that they could also navigate that in ways that they could feel empowered as well based on how they dressed. And secondly, thinking about the different forms of work that farming entails today and how that might empower women. So a lot of the women I spoke to advocated a brains versus brawn dichotomy. Now, traditionally that had kind of marginalised women in farming, but actually for the women I spoke to, that seemed to work well for them in terms of forging a niche in farming, in the sense that they believed there was more to farming than manual strength, that actually you needed to be quite strategic, resilient, and intelligent in terms of the business, running the business side of the farm, but also in interacting with animals and exercising a form of kind of sympathy within that. So again, it comes back to this contradiction really of I guess advocating traditional gender roles, but in a way that that offers something new and allows women to achieve within that environment.
Thank you, Bethany. Thank you. Really, really interesting research. Could I ask you to let the listeners know how they could get in touch if they want to learn more about your work or read more?
Yes, so you can follow me on Twitter, Beth Robertson 55, and from there you can have a look at my blog, and that's got a link to my email there as well.
That's great. Thank you so much for your time today, Bethany. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show. The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.